It all started with a dust cloud and a scream so shrill it stopped a bull mid-chew. My wife had just returned from morning feedings when the silence of the ranch cracked like thunder. A luxury SUV tore through the gravel road like it was a racetrack, kicking up dirt and sending our chickens flapping into chaos. Then came the banshee wail from the driver's side, echoing across the pasture like some demon had possessed the horn of a Cadillac Escalade. I looked up from the barn and saw her, the HOA president herself, standing in heels on our cracked ranch soil, waving a clipboard in one hand and pointing furiously with the other. And there she was, screaming in my wife's face, right in front of our barn, yelling about unapproved paint colors, community guidelines, and her personal hatred of windmills. What she didn't realize, what she refused to understand, was that our ranch wasn't even in her HOA. But logic didn't matter to Karen. That day she declared war. And she chose the wrong battlefield. The morning had started like any other. I was working on replacing the hinges on the south paddock gate, and my wife, Leah, was rounding up the goats that kept breaking into the dog run. We'd owned our land for 10 years, built every fence post by hand, and dealt with our fair share of nosy neighbors and nosebleed-priced city folks moving in from 3 states away. But we'd never encountered anything quite like Karen. She moved into the new subdivision that wrapped around the back of our property line about 3 months earlier, and since then, we'd noticed strange things. First it was flyers tucked under our gate about landscaping violations. Then a HOA newsletter showed up in our mailbox, addressed to us like we'd magically enrolled. But today? Today was a full-blown intrusion. Karen's SUV screeched to a stop in front of the barn like she was a cop in a high-speed chase. She flung the door open and marched out in a beige pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire feed budget. Leah stood calmly by the chicken coop, a half-filled feed bucket in hand and a bewildered expression on her face. Karen wasted no time launching into a tirade. She said the barn's red paint clashed with the community aesthetic. She said the smell of manure was an environmental offense. She claimed that the metal rooster weather vane on top of our house was an unlicensed structure. Then she had the nerve to point to our cattle fence and say it was a threat to neighborhood children. My wife, God bless her, didn't raise her voice. She didn't even flinch when Karen flailed her arms so hard a paper flew out of her hand and landed in a water trough. Leah just said, in that perfectly calm rancher tone, "Ma'am, you're about 300 yards outside your jurisdiction." But Karen wasn't listening. She kept ranting, turning red in the face, calling my wife names that would get you banned from a church potluck. Then, out of nowhere, she pulled out a laminated list, an actual laminated list, and started reading off supposed violations. She claimed we were in breach of the HOA's Section 7.3, Visual Harmony Standards. My wife blinked. I walked over and asked, "What harmony?" "This is a ranch. Our harmony includes cowbells and diesel." Karen didn't like that one bit. She turned her rage toward me and demanded we comply with the HOA's demands or face fines and legal action. I told her, flat out, we weren't part of her HOA. We'd owned this land long before her cookie-cutter neighborhood ever broke ground. That's when things took a turn for the worse. She whipped out her phone and began recording, narrating some warped story about us refusing to comply, accusing us of being hostile rural holdouts who endangered community unity. She angled her phone toward our goats, as if their very existence was some kind of criminal evidence. It would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. Leah asked her one more time, kindly but firmly, to leave our property. Instead, Karen walked right up to the barn doors, peered inside, and muttered something about filing a noise complaint over the tractor. That's when our ranch dog Bear, a Great Pyrenees with the patience of a monk and the bark of a thunderstorm, decided enough was enough. He stood between Karen and Leah, not aggressive, just still and massive and radiating calm authority. Karen shrieked, backed away, and accused us of owning an unlicensed attack animal. I stepped in before it got even dumber. I opened the gate, motioned to the gravel road she had come in on, and said, Back the way you came, ma'am. And don't come back unless you've brought muffins and an apology." She stormed to her SUV, but instead of leaving, she stomped back and planted herself at the property line like she was summoning some HOA spirit guide. "You think this is over?" she shouted. "You don't know who I am. My wife just said, 'We don't care who you are. We know where we are. This land isn't yours.'" Karen jumped in her SUV, threw it in reverse, and kicked up another storm cloud before speeding off in a trail of indignation and poorly executed rage. Later that afternoon, as we sat on the porch with cold lemonades and disbelief, Leah turned to me and said, "You know she'll be back." I nodded. People like Karen don't just let things go. They escalate. They organize meetings. They weaponize neighborhood Facebook groups. I could already imagine the fake fines, the reports to zoning authorities, and the HOA newsletters packed with veiled threat. But what Karen didn't realize, what she still hadn't grasped, is that we weren't scared of her title or her tantrums. We had the law on our side, the land beneath our boots, and a 10-foot fence that could stop a herd of bulls. And if push came to shove, we had something else too. A lake. A big, muddy, fish-filled lake just a few yards from the gravel road where she parked. That evening, I looked over at the winch rig parked by the barn, and for the first time in a while, I smiled. Karen had just started a war she wasn't ready for. She'd brought paperwork to a place where we fix problems with ropes, fences, and straight talk. But if she wanted drama, oh, she was going to get it. And the next time she stepped foot on this ranch, she wouldn't just leave with a warning. She might leave with wet shoes and a very confusing call to her insurance agent. The morning after Karen's ranch meltdown, we figured the storm had passed. Most rational people, after screaming their lungs out and nearly being barked off the property by a dog the size of a calf, would have slunk back into obscurity, maybe even taken a long nap and reconsidered their life choices. But not Karen. By the time we were pouring coffee and feeding the chickens, a new kind of absurdity had arrived. Our mailbox had been stuffed, not with normal mail or flyers, but with a neon pink envelope sealed in what looked like bedazzled duct tape. Leah opened it, hesitating only because it glistened like a Lisa Frank folder from the 90s. Inside was a 3-page typed document titled Official HOA Warning of Compliance Breach, listing made-up violations, threatening escalating fines, and attaching a $150 penalty for our use of agricultural infrastructure on residential adjacent lands. It was ridiculous, theatrical, and legally meaningless, but it was also just the beginning. That same day we noticed something strange. A neighbor from down the road, Margaret, a sweet lady who always brought us pecan pies during calving season, was suddenly cold and distant. When Leah waved at her on the road, Margaret looked away and drove past like we'd insulted her mother. Later, a friend at the feed store mentioned there was chatter in the local Facebook group, mostly from HOA members, about our ranch being out of control and causing distress to the subdivision. Karen, it seemed, had gone on a digital smear campaign, complete with manipulated photos of our barn, close-ups of a broken fence post, and even a post accusing us of illegally breeding livestock for resale. That one had Leah laughing so hard she nearly dropped a hay bale. "If they think I'm running some black market goat ring, I should start charging entry fees," she muttered. Still, it was more irritating than funny when a man from animal control showed up unannounced the next day. He was polite enough, but clearly uncomfortable as he explained that someone had submitted an anonymous tip about unhealthy livestock conditions. Leah showed him the barns, the vet logs, the clean stalls, and the ridiculously spoiled goats with their own designated misting fans. The inspector left apologetically, muttering something about how Karen's name kept coming up on his list lately. That's when we realized she wasn't just trying to scare us off with paper threats. She was trying to bury us in bureaucracy. A few days later, the nonsense evolved. I came home from a supply run to find the gate open, our sign, private property, no trespassing gone, and one of our calves wandering near the road. We checked the security cam and caught a blurry image of someone snipping the gate chain in broad daylight. And parked half on the utility road and half on our pasture grass was Karen's SUV. The brazen part? She left it there while she marched around the side of the property like she owned it. When Leah confronted her, Karen said she was performing a visual inspection for the HOA's Community Harmony Subcommittee. My wife told her if she didn't leave in 60 seconds, she'd be on the wrong end of a manure hose. Karen muttered something about us being hostile and said she would escalate this to the board. She left in a huff, but not before snapping pictures of our barn, our cows, and, somehow, our water hose like it was a crime scene. The breaking point came with the fence. One morning, we found the north side of the boundary fence taken down and replaced with a shiny, HOA-styled vinyl version, white, ornamental, and completely ineffective for holding cattle. Someone had dug up our posts, removed our barbed wire, and left behind a note stapled to a wooden stake that read, "For safety, aesthetics, and HOA compliance." It wasn't just sabotage. It was invasion. We called the sheriff, who came out and looked visibly tired when we explained it. "Karen again?" he asked before we even finished. He looked over the fence, shook his head, and said, "That woman doesn't know where the line ends." Literally. He filed a report, confirmed our boundaries were untouched by HOA authority, and said that technically, Karen was trespassing every time she drove on that utility road. That's when Leah got quiet. Not angry, just focused. She was thinking. That afternoon, a retired neighbor named Tom came by in his golf cart and parked himself under our porch shade with a sweet tea in hand. Tom was known for being the unofficial gossip courier of the area, but this time he brought more than chatter. He had minutes from the last HOA board meeting, which he managed to get from an accidentally forwarded email. In it, Karen had pitched something called the Property Expansion Initiative. The goal? Expand the HOA's legal borders by pushing an annexation proposal through a quiet county planning session. She was targeting 3 parcels of land, including ours. The catch was that annexation required voluntary agreement by landowners, or proof that the land was in violation of safety codes, which would then allow the HOA to argue for forced compliance. Karen was trying to manufacture that proof. All the fake citations, animal control visits, Facebook rumors. It was a paper trail designed to justify a hostile takeover of our property into the HOA's grasp. Now it all made sense. She wasn't just nosy or bossy. She was on a mission, and she had underestimated exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. Leah might have looked like a quiet ranch wife, but she had grown up rebuilding her family's farmland after a tornado flattened it. She once filed 6 legal claims in a single day when a developer tried to build over her family's well. She had grit, brains, and absolutely no tolerance for someone threatening her home. We knew what we had to do next. First, we put the sheriff's trespassing report to good use and posted laminated copies along the fence line. Second, we set up security cameras that sent footage directly to our phones, with motion detection alert. Third, we reinstalled our old winch rig and parked it right by the lake near the access road Karen kept using. And then Leah had one final touch. She laminated a fresh sign that read, "Warning, vehicles left on property will be moved at owner's risk. Lake depth, 14 feet." It was bold, perfectly legal, and undeniably clear. By nightfall, Karen had driven by twice, circling like a confused hawk looking for prey. But this time we were ready. The land wasn't just defended by wire and signs. It was now backed by facts, footage, and a level of petty patience only ranchers could master. Karen wanted a fight? She had one. She brought forms and HOA manuals. We brought ropes, steel, and a lake with Karen's name unofficially reserved on the bottom. And the next time her tires touched our grass, they wouldn't be rolling away dry. They'd be floating toward a lesson she wouldn't forget. Sunday morning dawned quiet and golden, with the kind of stillness that always came before something stirred up dust on the ranch. The birds were chirping. The cattle were lazily stretching and nudging around the feeding trough. And there it was, sitting exactly where we expected it to be, Karen's glossy, pearl-white SUV glinting in the sunrise like a misplaced trophy. She'd parked even farther in than usual this time, 2 wheels deep into our grass, not even pretending to stay on the edge of the gravel road. My wife stood beside me on the porch, sipping her coffee and nodding slowly, like she was mentally reviewing a to-do list. Next to her was our tow rig, a reinforced steel-frame truck with a heavy-duty winch we'd used to drag a stuck hay trailer out of the creek last winter. She didn't say anything at first. Just set her coffee down, adjusted her work gloves, and said, "Let's get this thing moving." I backed the tow rig into place while Leah unspooled the winch cable, threading it under the fence through a panel we'd opened earlier. She didn't look angry, just focused. For her, this wasn't revenge, it was cleanup. Just another chore on a list that had taken too long to cross off. We secured the hook underneath the SUV's frame with practiced ease. It didn't even have a locking mechanism engaged. Karen had clearly assumed she was immune to consequence. As I tightened the cable, I noticed something ridiculous. She'd left a framed HOA citation on the dashboard, facing outward, as if to declare her dominance over ranchland with laminated paper and suburban rage. My wife looked at it, snorted, and said, "Hope she enjoys the view from the bottom." We gave one last look around to make sure there were no hikers or kids in the vicinity. The lake wasn't huge, but it was deep, especially near the spot where the old irrigation trench had collapsed years ago. I climbed back into the rig and slowly started driving forward, pulling the winch cable taut. The SUV jerked, then rolled smoothly across the grass. Its tires bumped lightly over the edge of the slope, and then gravity took over. It picked up speed as it neared the lake, the angle working in our favor. My wife walked alongside it, holding the winch control remote, guiding it like a parade float. The splash was louder than I expected, a satisfying, cinematic plunge followed by the hiss of bubbles and the slow bobbing of the SUV's front end. It didn't sink all at once, just hovered like it was shocked at what had just happened. Then, slowly, it tilted, dipped nose first, and disappeared under the surface with a final gurgle. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the ripples smooth out. Then we heard it, the sound of high-pitched yelling coming from up the hill. I didn't even need to look to know it was her. Karen had arrived right on cue. She came racing down the slope in another car, a rental, by the looks of it, and when she saw the empty space where her SUV used to be, she stopped mid-run and screamed so loud it startled the cattle in the next field. She didn't see the lake at first. But when she did, she stood frozen for a second, then marched toward us like she was about to perform an exorcism. "You maniacs! You criminals! That vehicle cost more than this entire property." My wife calmly stepped between Karen and the lake, not out of fear, but because she refused to let Karen step one more inch onto our land. Karen's face turned red, then purple. She pointed toward the lake and shouted, "You'll pay for this! This is a federal offense." I responded from the truck window, "Actually, trespassing is. You've been warned." Repeatedly. That SUV was illegally parked on private land. Karen's eyes darted between us, her rage building like a kettle about to blow. I had every right. I was performing a community inspection. "You destroyed HOA property." My wife took out her phone and pressed play on a recording. Karen's voice came through clearly from a previous rant, saying, "I'll park wherever I want, it's all part of my view rights." Karen didn't like that. She slapped the phone out of Leah's hand, which was a bad move. The sheriff had told us in advance that we were allowed to document any harassment or illegal behavior. That slap just added assault to the list. I pulled my phone and called Deputy Parks immediately. "You might want to swing by," I said. "She's here, she's loud," and now she's slapped a phone out of Leah's hand. Karen tried to grab the phone from me too, but I held it out of reach and warned her not to take another step. She backed off, trembling with fury, and then pulled out her own phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. You'll regret this." You have no idea who you're messing with. That line again. She always said that, like she was the boss of some secret organization that operated above local law. 20 minutes later, Deputy Parks rolled in, slow and calm as ever. He looked at the tire marks, the lake, the soggy grass, and Karen still yelling near the shoreline, then raised an eyebrow and said, "Guess that view rights thing didn't hold up too well." Karen exploded. She demanded an arrest, pointed at us like we were international fugitives, and screamed that the sheriff was in on some conspiracy. Parks just asked her for documentation proving jurisdiction. She showed him her HOA badge. He laughed. Then he turned to us and asked, "Did you give her permission to park here?" "Nope," we said in unison. Karen tried one last desperate move. She said the lake was a public waterway, and that our actions endangered community property. That was when my wife calmly produced a laminated deed map showing the lake was 100% private. The look on Karen's face could have soured milk. Deputy Parks shook his head and said, "Ma'am, this is private land. You've been trespassing for weeks. These folks have video, audio, and a long list of complaints filed." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Finally, she muttered something about suing everyone, including the sheriff's department, and stomped back to her rental car. As she peeled off down the road, I turned to my wife and said, "Think she'll be back?" She smirked and said, "Not unless she brings scuba gear." We stood there for a while, looking at the lake, now calm again, the SUV resting at the bottom like a monument to entitlement. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clear. No more surprise inspections. No more bogus fines. Just the sweet smell of grass, the distant mooing of cows, and the quiet satisfaction that comes when someone finally learns a lesson in boundaries the hard way. And if Karen didn't learn it yet, well, we still had plenty of rope and an old winch that worked like a charm. For the first 2 days after the SUV dunk, we thought we had seen the last of Karen. The road stayed quiet, the mailbox was blessedly free of glittery violation notices, and even our goats seemed less agitated. It was almost peaceful. My wife resumed her morning garden routine, and I finally got a chance to finish resealing the tool shed, a job that had been put off for weeks due to Karen's constant drama. The tension we'd lived under for nearly a month seemed to dissipate into the June breeze. But we both knew it was too quiet, and if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand more than being ignored, it was being humiliated. She wasn't going to go down without launching something noisy and entirely unnecessary. It started with a live stream. One of the neighbors from the subdivision sent us a link early Monday morning with the words, "You've gotta see this." Karen had gone live on some HOA Facebook page, standing on her back patio with a makeshift podium, a stack of documents, and the self-importance of someone about to announce national emergency measures. She was wearing a power blazer, oversized sunglasses, and standing next to a poster board that read Community Integrity Emergency. Her opening words were, "We are under attack by lawless fringe landowners who have no respect for shared values." Then she played heavily edited footage of herself yelling at us from earlier encounters, cutting out every bit where she trespassed, cursed, or slapped at phones. She claimed we were environmental hazards, visual polluters, and, our personal favorite, landscape anarchists. The comments on the video were a mix of concerned HOA members nodding along and others laughing hysterically, especially when she tried to claim her SUV had been swept away by an illegal lake current. We were stunned at the lengths she was going to. But then came the twist. During the livestream, Karen announced she had retained legal counsel and was filing a civil lawsuit against us for destruction of property, emotional distress, and endangerment. She even pulled out what she claimed were photos of her car underwater. Photos that were clearly taken with a long lens from outside our fence. It wasn't just a grudge anymore. Karen was building a crusade. What she didn't know was that the sheriff's office had already reviewed the footage we gave them. They had determined that she had repeatedly trespassed, received multiple verbal and written warnings, and was the one who had violated private property boundaries. She also didn't know that her entire HOA board was quietly preparing a mutiny behind her back. Over the next few days, we started receiving anonymous emails, screenshots of internal HOA group chats, and even handwritten notes slid under our gate. Several board members had grown tired of Karen's antics, especially after the SUV incident went viral and local news picked up the story. Apparently, HOA meetings had devolved into shouting matches, with Karen doubling down and accusing her fellow board members of conspiring with the countryside. Then came the board meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday evening, held in the clubhouse of the subdivision. We weren't part of the HOA and had no obligation to attend, but we were invited anyway, anonymously with a note that read, "Bring popcorn." My wife and I decided to watch from a distance. We parked just outside the subdivision and walked in with a few neighbors we knew from town. The meeting room was packed. Cameras were rolling, residents lined the walls, and Karen was already at the front, pacing like a nervous theater director. She had a slideshow ready on a projector, complete with bullet points, grainy photos of our livestock, and a dramatic title slide that read, "The Rural Threat." Her presentation was everything we expected, long, loud, and laced with misinformation. She accused us of poisoning the community vibe. She showed drone footage of our barn and called it an affront to neighborhood harmony. She even showed a stock photo of a cow and claimed it was ours, saying it had glared menacingly at children. We might have laughed out loud if we weren't so stunned at how deep her delusions ran. But the audience wasn't buying it. The room shifted, and murmurs turned into interruptions. One man in the back stood up and said, "This isn't a legal case. This is your ego bleeding out." A woman nearby followed with, "You forged that letter you sent to the county. We saw the watermark." That was when the board president, someone who had once supported Karen, stood up and called for a vote. Not on us, on her. The motion was to remove Karen Hallbrook from her position as HOA president effective immediately, citing abuse of authority, misuse of funds, and community defamation. The vote wasn't even close. 32 in favor, 2 against. Karen stood frozen, blinking rapidly like the room had suddenly tilted. Then, in typical fashion, she refused to leave. She ranted about legal recourse, threatened to report the entire community, and finally stormed out after someone threatened to call security. We thought it would end there. But the very next morning, as we were feeding the horses, Karen appeared once more. She was driving a different vehicle, a rental again, and pulled up along the gravel road, this time staying just outside the property line. She rolled down her window, held up a thick envelope, and shouted, "You've been served." The envelope landed in the dirt near our fence and she sped off. Inside was a stack of poorly copied documents allegedly representing her lawsuit. But the address listed for the court didn't even exist. The law firm was fake. One of the pages still had a Google Docs formatting note on it. She had faked a lawsuit the same way she faked her HOA citations, with confidence and a printer. Deputy Parks came by later that afternoon after we called it in. He picked up the documents, flipped through them, and chuckled. "This one's my favorite," he said, holding up a page with the heading Article 17, Rural Visual Offenses. He asked if we wanted to press charges for continued harassment and trespassing. My wife looked out at the lake and said, "Let's give her one last out. If she comes back again, then yes. But this time, let her stew." That weekend, a local news station ran a story titled, "HOA President Ousted After SUV Ends Up in Rancher's Lake." They interviewed residents, featured footage of Karen's meltdown at the board meeting, and even included a brief interview with Deputy Parks, who diplomatically described the events as a severe misinterpretation of jurisdiction. From then on, the messages from neighbors started pouring in. Apologies, baked goods, even invitations to community barbecues. Some said they'd been manipulated by Karen's charm and constant pressure. Others admitted they were just scared to speak out. But now, with her gone, they wanted to make things right. It was odd. going from pariah to honorary guests in the same neighborhood that once considered our cattle a menace. But my wife, always the grace over grudges type, accepted their gestures. Still, she kept the winch cable clean and coiled, just in case Karen decided to test her luck again. Because in this story, the lake didn't just hold a sunken SUV. It held a memory, a boundary, and a message that screamed louder than Karen ever could. The week that followed was the quietest we'd had in months. No SUVs parked illegally. No screaming down the road. No absurd fines taped to our gate. Karen had vanished, at least temporarily, and the sense of calm on the ranch was almost suspicious. My wife joked that we should mount a plaque near the lake that read, "Here lies entitlement." Even the animals seemed to feel the change. The goats stopped trying to climb fences like they were part of some organized protest. The cattle grazed with the peaceful assurance of livestock who knew no clipboards were being waved at them. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we could just exist. But we weren't naive. We knew people like Karen didn't disappear forever. They hid, regrouped, and always came back when they thought they had a new angle or a fresh weapon. And sure enough, she wasn't done. It happened the following Friday. A county official showed up unannounced around noon with a clipboard and a very confused expression. His name was Marvin, and he was from the zoning office. Said he'd received an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures, offensive visual clutter, and aggressive wildlife practices. The words practically dripped off his tongue like they were unfamiliar. He apologized for the surprise visit and asked if we wouldn't mind walking the property with him. My wife didn't even blink. She invited him inside for lemonade first, then walked him through every barn, shed, fence, and corner of the ranch. Marvin couldn't find a single violation. He was polite, even sheepish by the end. When we asked if he'd mind telling us who filed the complaint, he admitted, "I'm not supposed to say, but let's just say her first name starts with a K and her last name sounds like fall down a well." We both laughed. What Marvin did share, though, was something that surprised us. Karen had filed nearly a dozen complaints, under different names, against properties near ours. Most had been tossed out, but 3 had made it into inspection status. She'd used fake addresses and even listed herself as a witness in multiple forms. She was trying to stir up chaos from the shadows, now that her HOA throne had crumbled. That night, Leah sat on the porch with her journal, flipping pages and thinking. "She's not going to stop," she said finally. "She'll keep doing this until someone stops her for good." I nodded, sipping my coffee, watching the moonlight shimmer on the lake where Karen's SUV rested in silence. "Then maybe it's time we go from reactive to proactive," I said. "Let's give her one final push over the cliff she's dangling from." The opportunity came faster than expected. We got a call from a local reporter who had seen the viral videos and read about the HOA board collapse. She was doing a feature on rural property rights and wanted to interview us about what happened. My wife hesitated at first, but after a long pause, she agreed. She said it wasn't about revenge, it was about warning others. If Karen was willing to lie, forge complaints, harass, and bully people with fake power, she could do it to someone else who didn't have a strong fence and a winch. The reporter came out 2 days later, and the interview was everything we hoped. Honest, calm, and grounded in fact. My wife walked her through the ranch, showed her the paperwork proving we were outside HOA jurisdiction, and even played clips from Karen's rant. The piece aired the following Sunday. By Monday, it had over 3 million views and a trending hashtag Lake Karen. The floodgates opened after that. People from all over the country began sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. Karen became a symbol, an avatar of overreach and ego dressed in business casual. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. Within a week, the county commission announced a review of HOA policies and borders in the area. Karen was officially blacklisted from the county planning council, where she'd apparently been trying to worm her way in as a community advisor. A deeper investigation began into her previous HOA conduct, and it turned out she'd misappropriated funds for personal use, charging extravagant meals and unnecessary landscaping to the HOA budget. The last time we saw her in person was both poetic and slightly sad. It was a Wednesday morning, and I was out by the lake clearing some reeds when I heard a car pull up at the far edge of the gravel. I looked up and there she was, standing next to her rental again. This time, she wasn't yelling. She wasn't holding any papers. She was just staring at the water, arms crossed, face unreadable. My wife joined me and we both walked toward her slowly, staying on our side of the fence. Karen glanced at us but didn't speak. After a few seconds she asked, "Is it still down there?" Leah nodded. "Yep. Insurance wouldn't even cover it once they saw the trespassing footage." Karen looked back at the lake. "You ruined me," she said, almost like it was a quiet confession. My wife tilted her head slightly and replied, "No. You did that to yourself. We just stopped you from ruining anyone else." Karen didn't respond. She turned, got back in her car, and drove away. We haven't seen her since. Word is, she moved to another state, trying to restart her life in a new community with no HOAs. A few folks from the subdivision told us she tried to sue the HOA for wrongful removal, but the case was thrown out almost immediately. Now her name was more infamous than influential. She'd become the cautionary tale. The woman who thought she could bend private land to her will and ended up sinking her own reputation instead. The weeks that followed were filled with repair and restoration. Not to the ranch, that had always held strong, but to the relationships with our neighbors. People who had once kept their distance now stopped by to chat, to offer eggs or jam, or simply to thank us for standing firm. The HOA elected a new board, one that was more interested in maintaining community gardens than terrorizing property lines. My wife was even offered a spot on the county land committee to help advise on boundary integrity and rural rights. She accepted, not for politics but for peace. One evening, as we sat by the porch watching the sun dip low and orange across the hills, Leah leaned over and said, "You know, I still can't believe we had to tow an SUV into a lake to get here." I laughed and replied, "Sometimes the quickest path to peace is paved with splash damage." The winch was back in storage, the signs had been replaced with new ones that simply read, "Respect the fence," and the ranch returned to what it was always meant to be, a place of work, peace, and occasional goat-based chaos. Karen may have started a war, but it was her own arrogance that buried her in the mud. And as the seasons rolled on and the lake settled into stillness again, one truth remained as steady as the earth beneath our boots. Some boundaries don't need a fence. They just need to be defended once, loudly enough, that no one dares cross them again.